Elizabeth parked her car in the driveway, exhaling as she reached for the grocery bags in the passenger seat. It had been a long day, back-to-back meetings, a fight with a slow internet connection, and now, the Arizona heat pressing down on her skin like a relentless weight. All she wanted was a cool shower, a quiet dinner, and maybe some time by the pool before bed. But the moment she stepped out of the car, something felt off. Her eyes landed on the side gate. It was slightly ajar, not wide open, just enough to be noticeable. She always locked it, always. Her stomach clenched. Maybe the wind had nudged it loose? Maybe the latch was faulty? But then her gaze dropped to the concrete path leading to the backyard. Wet footprints, barefoot, leading out. A sharp pulse of irritation shot through her. She pushed open the gate, stepping inside, and stopped cold. The backyard, her sanctuary, looked like a scene from a careless summer hangout. A pool float was pushed to the side, half deflated. A towel, not hers, was draped lazily over a lounge chair. A half-empty can of soda sat on the small table near the water. The pool itself had that subtle disturbance, the kind that happens when someone's been in it recently. Someone had been here. Her pulse quickened as she turned, scanning for any sign of movement. Silence. Just the soft rustling of palm trees in the breeze. The distant hum of a lawnmower from another yard. But whoever had invaded her space, they were gone now. Her first instinct was to be rational. Maybe a maintenance worker? Maybe a kid playing around? But that didn't explain the footprints leaving the yard. The more she thought about it, the more unsettling it became. Someone had come in, used her pool, and left, not even bothering to hide it, like they thought it was theirs. Elizabeth wasn't the type to jump to conclusions. She wasn't paranoid. But this wasn't just annoying, it was personal. For years, she had worked hard to build this life. She had chosen this house because of the peace it promised. A quiet street, good neighbors, a place where she could finally enjoy what she had built without intrusion. And now, that boundary had been crossed. She checked the side latch, securing it tighter this time. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe a neighborhood kid got curious. She decided not to overthink it. But as she walked back inside, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling. This didn't feel like an accident, and something told her it wouldn't be the last time. Elizabeth sat in her living room that evening, staring out at the darkened pool. The backyard lights cast long, eerie reflections across the water, making the ripples from the wind look unnatural. She had spent years designing this space, making it perfect, her own retreat from the world, but now it didn't feel like hers. It felt violated. She tried to push it out of her mind. Maybe it was a one-time thing, a mistake, kids being kids. But something about it didn't sit right. The casualness of it, the wet footprints leading out, like whoever had been here wasn't even in a rush, like they had done this before. Shaking her head, she grabbed her phone and scrolled through the neighborhood group on Facebook. She wasn't looking for answers, just a sign, something to confirm she wasn't overreacting. And then, buried between lost dog posts and garage sale announcements, she saw it. A comment under a picture of a different house's pool. Looks like summer's officially here. The community pool is back in business, LOL. She frowned, clicking into the replies. Who needs to pay for a pool when the neighborhood has so many? LOL, just hop the fence and enjoy. Most of the comments were laughing emojis, jokes about how no one really owns a pool in the suburbs, and how it's practically a shared amenity. Elizabeth's stomach twisted. This wasn't an accident. It was a thing. Her pool wasn't just her pool anymore. It was an open invitation. Her grip on the phone tightened. She wasn't naive. People didn't respect boundaries until they were forced to. Standing, she walked straight to the back door, flipped on the patio lights, and stepped outside. The night air was cooler, but her frustration burned hot. She moved toward the gate and double-checked the latch, testing its strength. Secure. But clearly, that hadn't been enough. She turned, scanning the fence. It wasn't short, but it wasn't impossible to climb. The thought made her stomach churn. She didn't like the idea of strangers scaling her fence like it was a minor inconvenience. Back inside, she grabbed her laptop and started researching. Security cameras, motion sensor lights, high-tech gate locks. Everything she could do to make sure this didn't happen again. But part of her knew some people didn't care. Some people needed more than a locked door to get the message. And something told her that whoever had been in her pool, they weren't done yet. Elizabeth wasn't the type to let things slide. The next morning, she drove straight to the hardware store and bought the sturdiest locks she could find. Heavy-duty, weatherproof, impossible to pick without serious effort. When she got home, she installed them herself, making sure the latch clicked shut with finality. No more easy access, no more community pool, but locks could only do so much. She needed eyes on the yard. That evening, she set up motion-activated cameras, positioning them at key points, one facing the gate, another watching over the pool, and a third aimed at the back fence. If anyone so much as stepped onto her property, she'd know about it. For the next few days, everything was quiet. No footprints, no wet towels, no signs of trespassing. Maybe, just maybe, they had gotten the message. Then came Saturday. She was in her kitchen making coffee when a notification popped up on her phone. Motion detected, backyard. Her heart jumped. She tapped the screen, pulling up the live feed. There they were, two teenagers, both soaking wet, standing by the pool like they belonged there. One of them was laughing, shaking out his hair. The other grabbed a towel, her towel, draped over a lounge chair. Elizabeth's blood boiled. She bolted outside, throwing the back door open so hard it slammed against the wall. The boys froze. One dropped the towel. The other looked at her like she was the intruder. Neither moved. Elizabeth didn't yell. She didn't have to. The fury in her eyes was enough. She pointed at the gate. They didn't argue. They didn't even try. They scrambled to gather their things and ran, slipping on the wet concrete as they bolted out of the yard. The gate clicked shut behind them. Elizabeth stood there, chest rising and falling, heart hammering against her ribs. They had ignored the locks. They had ignored the fact that this was her home. She checked the camera footage, rewinding until she saw how they got in. They hadn't broken the lock. They had climbed the fence. Her jaw clenched. This wasn't over. It was getting worse. She wasn't just dealing with careless kids anymore. She was dealing with entitlement, and she had a feeling this wasn't the last time they'd try. Elizabeth didn't sleep well that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those boys standing by her pool, dripping water onto the stone, acting like they had every right to be there. It wasn't fear keeping her awake. It was anger. Not just at them, but at the sheer audacity of it all. The locks, the cameras, the warnings. None of it mattered. They had ignored everything. And worse, they weren't even ashamed. By morning, her frustration had settled into something sharper. She wasn't going to let this continue. If they thought they could treat her home like a free public space, they were about to learn otherwise. She spent the afternoon reinforcing every possible entry point. The locks were already strong, but she added a secondary latch to the side gate, one that required a key from both sides. The fence? She lined the top with decorative metal spikes. Subtle, legal, but impossible to climb without serious effort. Then she made a trip to the sign shop. If people ignored common sense, she would make them think twice. The new sign, big and bold, read, "Private property, trespassers will be recorded and prosecuted." She mounted it directly on the fence where no one could miss it. But the real test came that evening. She had just settled in with a book when another motion alert popped up on her phone. Backyard. Her stomach twisted, fingers tightening around the device as she opened the camera feed. Three figures stood outside the gate. Teenagers. Different from before, but the same smug attitude. One of them pointed at the sign and laughed. Another nudged the gate, testing it. They weren't climbing this time, just loitering, whispering, watching, like they were debating if it was worth the risk. Elizabeth's pulse pounded. She wasn't about to wait and see. She flipped on the backyard floodlights. The sudden burst of brightness cut through the night, spotlighting them like stage performers caught in an unwanted scene. They jerked back, startled. One cursed under his breath. Then they ran. Elizabeth watched them disappear into the darkness, a grim satisfaction settling over her. They were testing her, but they weren't ready for what she had planned next. Elizabeth sat in her car outside a local security store, staring at the bag in the passenger seat. Inside were two more motion-activated cameras, a new alarm system, and something she hadn't planned on buying, a motion-triggered sprinkler system. She hadn't even known those existed until she started digging deeper into deterrence for trespassers. The reviews were glowing. People swore by them, saying they scared off everything from raccoons to package thieves. But Elizabeth had one goal in mind: humiliate the next person who tried to step foot in her yard. When she got home, she wasted no time setting it all up. The sprinklers were discreet, installed along the fence line and near the pool. The system was simple. The moment someone crossed the invisible barrier, they'd be hit with a powerful jet of water. It wouldn't harm them, but it would send a clear message. As the sun set, she took a step back, admiring her work. Everything was in place. The lights, the cameras, the new locks. This was no longer just a backyard. It was a fortress. Then, as if the universe wanted to test her, an alert buzzed on her phone. Motion detected. Backyard. Elizabeth's heart pounded as she opened the live feed. There they were. A group of four this time. Two boys, two girls. Teenagers. Maybe a little older than the last ones. They were standing near the gate, laughing, pointing at something on one of their phones. One of the boys stepped forward and yanked on the handle, but the new lock held firm. He muttered something, then turned to the others, gesturing toward the fence. They were about to climb. Elizabeth exhaled slowly, finger hovering over the manual activation for the sprinklers. But she didn't need to press anything. The moment the first boy hoisted himself up, the system kicked in. A powerful jet of water shot out, drenching him instantly. He let out a startled yell, lost his grip, and fell backward into the dirt. The others shrieked as the sprinklers activated in unison, turning the entire perimeter into a soaking, chaotic mess. Elizabeth watched through the camera as the group scrambled away, slipping on wet grass, tripping over themselves in their rush to escape. She sat back, letting out a long breath. It wasn't over. Not yet. But tonight, she had won. Elizabeth woke up the next morning feeling something she hadn't felt in weeks: satisfaction. The memory of those kids scrambling away, drenched and humiliated, played over in her mind like a highlight reel. She hadn't just scared them off, she had sent a message. Her property was not up for grabs, but deep down, she knew better than to think this was over. Some people didn't learn their lesson the first time. She made herself a coffee and stepped outside onto the patio. The air was cool, the pool still, and for the first time in days, there were no footprints, no floating soda cans, no evidence of intrusion. The sprinkler system had done its job. But as she sipped her drink, she noticed something odd near the gate: a single muddy footprint on the concrete, small enough to belong to one of the kids from last night. Her stomach tightened. Had someone come back after she went to sleep? She checked her phone, scrolling through the security footage. Around 3 in the morning, the camera had picked up movement near the fence. The quality wasn't perfect in the dark, but she could make out a single figure standing just outside her yard, not trying to climb, not testing the lock, just watching. Elizabeth's grip tightened around her phone. She replayed the clip. The figure stood there for nearly 2 full minutes before disappearing into the darkness. No attempt to break in, no vandalism, just observing. That was worse. She had been expecting more teenagers, another reckless attempt to treat her home like a playground. But this was different. This wasn't about the pool anymore. Her gut told her, whoever it was, they weren't just looking for a swim. She spent the afternoon reinforcing her security even further. The cameras were already positioned well, but she adjusted the angles to cover every possible blind spot. The lights were bright, but she installed additional ones along the perimeter. And the sprinklers? She upgraded the settings, increasing the pressure and expanding the coverage area. By the time the sun set, her backyard was impenetrable. But even with all the upgrades, one thought wouldn't leave her mind. Whoever had been outside her fence last night, they'd be back. Elizabeth sat in her living room, fingers tapping lightly against the armrest of her chair, eyes locked on the security feed displayed on her laptop screen. The footage from last night looped in her mind: a lone figure standing outside her yard, unmoving, watching. It wasn't the reckless arrogance of kids sneaking into her pool. This was something else, something deliberate. She checked the time. Nearly midnight. The house was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. The motion alerts had been quiet all evening, but that didn't mean she was safe. If whoever had been outside her fence wanted something, they'd be back. The minutes dragged. She tried reading, scrolling through her phone, watching TV, but her focus was fractured, attention constantly snapping back to the live feed. Nothing. Just an empty backyard, still and untouched. Then, motion detected, front yard. Her heart kicked against her ribs as she clicked the notification. The camera feed loaded, and there it was. Someone standing at the edge of her driveway, just beyond the reach of the porch light. Not a teenager. A man. He wasn't moving toward the house, just standing there like he was waiting for something. He had his hands in his pockets, head tilted slightly, like he was assessing the place. Elizabeth's breath came shallow and slow. This was different. Teenagers hopped fences for fun. They snuck into pools because they thought they could get away with it. This man wasn't here for that. She reached for her phone, fingers hovering over the emergency dial. But before she could press anything, the man turned and walked away. Not hurried, not startled, just leaving. She watched the feed until he disappeared down the street. Then she rewound the footage, watching again. His face never fully visible, his posture casual, too casual, like he wanted to be seen just enough to make her uneasy. Elizabeth exhaled sharply, shutting the laptop. The pool had started this, but now it wasn't about that anymore. Someone was testing her, and she had no intention of failing. Elizabeth barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of the man standing at the edge of her driveway burned into her mind. He hadn't broken in, hadn't vandalized anything, hadn't even come close to her house. But that was the problem. He hadn't needed to. His presence alone was enough to leave a message. I see you. By morning, the uneasy feeling had settled into something sharper. She wasn't afraid. She was furious. The trespassing kids had been annoying, entitled, reckless. But this was different. This was deliberate. Someone wanted her to feel watched. She grabbed her coffee and stepped outside, scanning the street. Everything looked normal. Cars parked in driveways, sprinklers watering neatly trimmed lawns, a jogger passing by with headphones in. But it was hard to see her neighborhood the same way now. It felt less like home and more like a place where she was being observed. She checked the security footage again. The man had approached from the left side of the street. No car in sight. He had walked up on foot, which meant he lived nearby, or at least he knew the area well enough to blend in. Elizabeth wasn't about to sit around and wait for him to come back. She spent the next few hours reinforcing everything she could. The cameras were good, but she upgraded the storage, making sure no footage would be erased. The motion lights? She adjusted them to trigger at the slightest movement. She even called a security company to discuss adding a monitored system. By the afternoon, she felt more prepared, but there was still one problem. She didn't know who she was dealing with, so she started asking around. She kept it casual at first, bringing it up in conversations with neighbors. Had anyone seen a stranger walking through the area last night? Someone hanging around where they shouldn't be? The responses were frustratingly vague. It's probably nothing. We get all kinds of people passing through. Maybe it was just someone lost. Nobody seemed concerned. Nobody had seen anything. Or if they had, they weren't saying. That evening, as she checked the front camera one last time before heading to bed, her phone buzzed. Motion detected. Side yard. Her breath caught. Not the front, not the backyard. The side yard. The one spot she hadn't reinforced yet. She tapped the notification and the live feed loaded. A shadow moved past the fence. Slow. Controlled. Someone was there. And this time, they weren't just watching. Elizabeth's hands clenched around her phone as she watched the grainy footage of the figure moving along her side fence. The shape was barely visible in the dim lighting, just a shifting shadow against the wooden panels. Not rushing, not hesitating. Just there. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but her mind was sharp, calculating. She didn't panic. Not yet. She switched to the other camera angles, trying to get a better view, but the person stayed just outside the floodlight's reach. Smart. Too smart for some random teenager looking for trouble. She forced a slow breath, trying to think. This was a test. Locks, cameras, lights. None of it had been enough to keep them away. This wasn't about the pool anymore. Whoever this was, they weren't here for a swim. The shadow moved again. A hand reached out, fingers brushing against the gate, testing it. The heavy-duty lock held firm, but that wasn't the point. They weren't trying to break in. They were letting her know they could. Rage burned through her veins, but she didn't move from her spot. She wasn't about to give them the reaction they wanted. Instead, she tapped the manual control on her phone, activating the sprinklers. A high-pressure jet of water exploded from the ground, cutting through the silence. The figure jerked back, momentarily caught off guard. The camera caught the briefest glimpse of movement, shoulders twisting, an arm flinching, a flash of dark clothing, before they bolted. Elizabeth didn't breathe until the yard was empty again. She replayed the footage twice. There was no mistaking it. That wasn't a kid. That was an adult. Someone who moved like they had done this before. Someone who knew how to stay out of sight, how to push just enough to be noticed without being caught. A trespasser, a stalker, a predator. She swallowed hard, her mouth dry. This wasn't over, and she was done playing defense. The next move? It was hers. Elizabeth didn't sleep. She sat in the dim glow of her laptop, replaying the footage over and over, studying every movement. The way the figure lingered, the way they tested the gate but didn't force it, the way they moved just outside the brightest part of the security lights. They knew what they were doing. That much was clear. She wasn't afraid. She was angry. She had spent years building this life. Her home was supposed to be her sanctuary, a place of peace, not a hunting ground for some faceless intruder testing her patience. She had let the pool situation slide at first, assuming it was just reckless kids with no respect. But this was different. This wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate, and she refused to be someone's target. At dawn, she took action. Her first stop was a security company. She upgraded her entire system. More cameras, better angles, higher resolution, and real-time monitoring that would alert her phone instantly. The sprinklers had been satisfying, but now she was beyond playing games. She added motion-activated alarms to the gates and fence line. If anyone tried stepping onto her property again, they wouldn't just get wet. They'd trigger a deafening, high-pitched siren that would wake the entire neighborhood. She installed reinforced locks on every entry point. No more simple latches, no more weak points. If someone wanted in, they'd have to break down a door. Then she went even further. She set up fake warning signs around the perimeter. 24/7 security patrol and live guard dogs on site. There were no guards, no dogs. But perception was everything. By the time she was done, her house wasn't just a home. It was a fortress. That night, she waited. She didn't go to bed. She didn't turn off the lights. She sat near the security monitor, watching the live feed, waiting for the moment that shadow would return. Hours passed. Nothing. Then, motion detected. Backyard. Elizabeth's breath caught, adrenaline spiking as she tapped the screen. A figure stood just inside the fence line, frozen under the floodlights. But they weren't moving. They were staring directly at the camera, watching her. For the first time, a chill crawled down her spine. This wasn't just some random trespasser. This was personal. And whoever they weren't done. But neither was she.